In 1945, the world celebrated. Cities erupted in cheers. Soldiers embraced strangers in the streets. Newspapers printed a single word in massive letters: peace. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally over, or so it seemed, because while the guns fell silent and flags were raised, something far more dangerous was quietly taking shape. Something written not on battlefields, but on paper. Something that would decide the fate of nations long after the last shot was fired. The war didn't truly end when the fighting stopped. It ended when agreements were signed. And those agreements didn't bring peace. They reshaped conflict itself. As World War II drew to a close, the Allied leaders faced a problem unlike any before. Entire continents were shattered. Millions were dead or displaced. Old empires were collapsing under their own weight. The question was no longer how to win the war. That was already decided. The real question was far more dangerous. What kind of world would exist after victory? That decision would not be made by soldiers in trenches or civilians in ruins. It would be made by a handful of men meeting behind closed doors, racing against time, exhaustion, and growing mistrust. In February 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta. On the surface, it appeared to be a moment of unity. The leaders of the Allied world planning a peaceful future together. But beneath the handshakes and photographs, each man walked into that room with very different goals. The agreements reached at Yalta promised a new world order. Germany would be divided to prevent future aggression. A United Nations would be created to preserve peace. Eastern Europe would be allowed free elections, giving liberated nations the right to choose their own governments. On paper, it sounded hopeful. In reality, it was compromise born from desperation. Western leaders needed the Soviet Union to finish the war against Nazi Germany and to help defeat Japan. Stalin, having lost millions of lives, wanted something else entirely: security, influence, and control over Eastern Europe. Everyone believed they could manage the consequences later. They couldn't. As the war ended, Soviet troops did not withdraw from Eastern Europe. Instead, they stayed. Communist governments were installed. Opposition voices were silenced. Elections promised on paper either never happened or were carefully controlled. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, nations that had suffered through occupation, found themselves under a new kind of dominance, not through open conquest, but through agreements signed far away from their borders. This wasn't liberation. It was occupation with legal language. By the summer of 1945, the mood had changed completely. Roosevelt was dead. Churchill would soon be voted out of office. And the United States now possessed a weapon that could end entire cities in seconds. At Potsdam, unity collapsed into suspicion. The Allies argued over Germany's future, reparations, borders, and responsibility. The shared enemy was gone, and without it, the alliance began to fracture. Potsdam did not resolve tensions. It exposed them. What emerged was not a plan for lasting peace, but a framework for division. Nowhere was this more visible than in Germany itself. Once the heart of Nazi power, Germany was carved into occupation zones controlled by former allies who no longer trusted each other. What was meant to prevent another dictatorship, instead, created two rival states, locked into opposing ideologies. Berlin became a symbol of contradiction, a Western city trapped deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. Walls replaced front lines. Surveillance replaced open combat. The city wasn't rebuilt as a unified capital. It was turned into a pressure point. As Europe settled into this uneasy division, Winston Churchill would describe what had happened with chilling clarity. An iron curtain, he said, had descended across the continent. That curtain was not an accident. It was a result of post-war agreements that value control over cooperation. The war ended with tanks pulling back, But ideology is moving forward. The fighting had stopped. The conflict had not. And Europe was only part of the story. In Asia, the end of World War II produced its own unstable compromises. Korea, liberated from Japanese occupation, was divided hastily along the 38th parallel. The division was meant to be temporary, a short-term administrative solution. It became permanent. Two governments emerged. Two ideologies hardened. Within 5 years, the Korean Peninsula exploded into war, killing millions. The conflict was not a failure of peace. It was a direct consequence of rushed post-war decisions. China experienced a similar fate. The war against Japan had temporarily frozen its civil conflict, but once Japan surrendered, the struggle resumed with greater intensity. The post-war order failed to stabilize China, instead accelerating one of the most significant ideological shifts of the 20th century. In the Middle East, the collapse of European empires created power vacuums that were filled with uncertainty and resentment. Borders were drawn quickly, often without regard for communities' history or identity. Promises made during wartime contradicted one another, and no agreement fully addressed them. The result was not stability, but permanent tension. So, why did these agreements fail to deliver peace? Because they were never designed for the world that followed. They were built under pressure, shaped by fear, and driven by power. The goal wasn't long-term harmony. It was immediate control, security for the victors, containment of rivals. The war ended, but distrust took its place. Instead of armies clashing openly, a new kind of conflict emerged. Espionage replaced invasions. Proxy wars replaced declarations. Economic pressure, propaganda, and nuclear standoffs defined the era that followed. The Cold War was not an accident. It was a natural outcome of how World War II ended. History often presents 1945 as a clean ending, victory, liberation, rebuilding. But real history is rarely that simple. The end of the war did not close a chapter. It fractured it. Millions of people lived their entire lives behind borders they never chose. Governments rose and fell based on decisions made in rooms they would never see. For leaders, the war ended with signatures. For ordinary people, it simply changed shape. The post-war agreement succeeded in preventing another global war, but at a cost. They locked the world into constant tension, endless rivalry, and conflicts without clear beginnings or endings. World War II did not end in 1945. It evolved into borders, into doctrines, into silent wars that shaped generations. The most controversial post-war agreements did not just define the aftermath of the war. They defined the world we still live in. Because sometimes the most dangerous battles don't begin with explosions. They begin when the war is declared over. The world celebrated peace in 1945. What it received was a quieter war,